Hello, and welcome to this originally produced podcast from the University of Central Florida's Office of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives. I'm Farah Shah, the Conflict Transformation Fellow, along with Mohammedelamien, the Terrorism Studies Intern.
Joining us today is the esteemed Owen Kirby, Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa region at the International Republican Institute, as well as the former Director of the Office of Transition Initiatives at USAID. Additionally, Mr. Kirby serves as non-resident fellow here at our Office of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives at the University of Central Florida. His impressive work doesn't stop there. Mr. Kirby has served as the Senior Governance Advisor for the U.S. Department of State in Kandahar, Afghanistan, and has a prolific writing portfolio which demonstrates his dedication to regional conflicts specific to the Middle East and North Africa region and the implications of contemporary and historical, social, political, and economic context of the region. Mr. Kirby, thank you so much for your time today and welcome back to the office.
No, thank you, Farah. Good to be here.
We'd like to jump right in with you here, Mr. Kirby.
Please.
I'm sure we can all agree we are living in unprecedented times, and much of the limelight in recent months has been on U.S. foreign policy centered on regional conflicts in the Middle East. We'd like to ask you an open-ended question, but one that a lot of listeners may have. How would you describe the transformation of U.S. foreign policy objectives in the Middle East now versus perhaps 7 or 8 years ago, maybe in comparison to the freedom agenda during the Bush administration?
If I compare the Middle East and U.S. approach towards the Middle East, say up through the Biden administration and up to say October 7th, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel and captured kidnapped a number of Israeli citizens. For the preceding, say, 10 years, the U.S. was in a sort of a mode of status quo maintenance. If you go back to the George W. Bush administration in early years of the Obama administration, particularly during the Arab Spring, the U.S. had some very ambitious goals for the region. During the Bush administration, George W. Bush had the Freedom Agenda, and the Freedom Agenda was aimed at transforming the Middle East, transforming the economies, the cultures, societies, empowering women, developing free market economies, and very ambitious set of policy goals for the region. Fast forward 10 years past the Arab Spring, the U.S. Policies started veering towards sort of acceptance of the status quo, accepting the state of the Middle East, the conditions in countries, backing off quite significantly from the previous agenda of changing or transforming the Middle East from one-party states or monarchies into fully fledged democracies with free market systems. That fell off the agenda for a number of reasons. The cost of the two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq exceeding $2 trillion, taxpayer funds that put America in debt, that diverted funds that could have gone towards transforming the United States, but rather it was targeted towards transforming the region, and as we know, not successfully. So today, I would say, our policies are aimed at just dealing with the realities in the region, trying to maintain stability at the same time, but not having truly ambitious agendas, and not imposing our own will, our own designs on the region.
Along a similar vein of thought, you've written several articles on the conflict stemming from the occupied West Bank, the Gaza enclave, and Israel. In one especially moving piece from Modern Diplomacy entitled Palestinian Reform Redux, you highlight the need to focus on Palestinian needs as opposed to looking towards what you described as unaccountable and unpopular leadership. Given the recent ceasefire agreement, shaky in of itself, can you tell us what may inform the chances of lasting peace in the region over the next couple of months? Has your opinion changed in regard to what is necessary to implement in Israel and Palestine to help with that stability?
A set of challenges in the region. My premise has long been, I've worked on Palestinian issues going back into the early Oslo days when the United States and the international community was focused on institution building, helping Palestinians develop the institutions and the foundations for lasting peace, for self-governance. Unfortunately, we're in a situation today where the commitment of all sides to this two-state solution is somewhat in question. However, assuming that two-state solution or some form of Palestinian independence or autonomy is still on the table, then we have to look back at what it's going to take for a Palestinian entity of some sort is viable, is transparent, is able to deliver, on the needs of Palestinian citizens. Unfortunately, today, the political system within the Palestinian Authority in no way reflects the aspirations of the Oslo Agreements. And the Oslo Agreements are, in fact, the legal basis for the Palestinian Authority, for the presidency of the Palestinian Authority, for all the institutions. And yet, if you look at the Palestinian Authority today, it is far from the ambitions, and not just the ambitions, but the actual prerequisites set forth in the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords dictated or mandated that there be separation of powers, that there be elected legislature, that the legislature be empowered, that there be a judiciary that was independent. These things have long passed. There hasn't been an election in the Palestinian Authority since 2006 for the Palestinian Legislative Council. President Abbas was elected in January 2005, and it is now 20 years later, and he is still the president. So, in my mind, the system of Palestinian governance today is in violation of the Oslo Accords, which is the basis for, the PA itself.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I'm against the Palestinian Authority. I just think we need to get back to the fundamentals of the Oslo Accords if we're going to see a viable, democratic, hopefully prosperous Palestinian entity. But again, this assumes that this is still on the table. We talked today about two-state solution. Biden administration sort of resurrected the terminology and the goal of two-state solution. However, the two-state solution, as we understood it at the time of the Oslo Accords, is probably no longer viable. You look at just the geography, you look at developments on the ground that have taken place, it's hard to imagine two-state solution materializing anytime soon. 75% of the Palestinian population is under the age of 35, therefore they were either not born or in infancy at the time that the Oslo Accords were signed. So to ask Palestinians today, do you support two-state solution? Well, it doesn't really have much meaning. So we're going to have to sort of repackage and re-envision what a two-state solution would look like today, given that 40 years or so have passed since Oslo. It's a tremendous challenge. I don't see any way out of the dilemma, the Palestinian-Israeli dilemma, unless there's some realization of Palestinian rights to self-determination of some form. Of course, they need to be negotiated with Israel and probably other neighbors. But we have to get, I think, back to fundamentals. We probably have to go back to scratch.
On a slightly more happy note, in your term working for USAID, what role have you seen it play in global stability? Is there a time you can recall feeling especially moved by the impacts your work for the agency provided for the regions you worked in?
If you look back at and I was young at the time, probably just coming out of college. But if you look back at the transformation, and this is probably the greatest success story of U.S. foreign assistance, USAID. In terms of foreign assistance, you can go back to the post-World War II period, but this was prior to the formation of the U.S. Agency for International Development under John Kennedy. But after World War II, obviously, the Marshall Plan is probably the exemplar of U.S. foreign assistance in the rebuilding of Europe after the great tragedies and devastations of World War II. But if you look at the transformation of much of Europe from the period of the Cold War to today, this is a product of U.S. soft power and U.S. foreign assistance. The successful transition that much of Eastern Europe made after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact to democratic, free market, stable members of the international community. Most of the countries previously in the Eastern Bloc are now members of the European Union, which of course is a source of some irritation in conflict with Russia and some of its allies. But that transformation that occurred in Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall was a direct consequence of effective U.S. foreign assistance.
I wanted to just interject. I remember last semester I had a teacher, and he assigned this book called The Ugly American, and the book, it was an incredible book. It was really detailed, and it had these little stories that had to do with foreign aid and foreign service. And one thing that it really mentioned, and something that you covered yesterday in your presentation, was the idea that a lot of times we give money without really listening to the locals on the ground. You know, what do they need? Do you feel like that's something that you've continued to see as an issue in terms of foreign aid and foreign assistance? Is there a lack of communication between locals and even like government to local in terms of where that money should be going, or how that money can be used to best effectively be implemented in the area or meet the goals that we're looking at?
I mean, we don't always get this right, but this is not a problem with foreign assistance per se. It's a challenge of implementation. Where we've seen, I think, the greatest successes is where we allow our local partners or local allies to take the lead. The term, the ugly American, that comes from that's sort of the Boy Scout spirit. And this is a spirit of America. There's no challenge that we can't overcome, that we can't conquer. This is, I think, the American history. You look at World War II, you look at the post-World War II period leading up to putting a man on the moon. Anything we set our sights on as a country, at least that's our sort of our romantic view of the United States, if you can call it that, is we can do anything. And the reality is, and recent history has shown that from the Vietnam War up to, I think, the collapse of Afghanistan, that we don't necessarily always have the answers. And we can be as well-meaning, as well-intentioned, and put our blood, sweat, and tears into any undertaking, but it doesn't mean we're always going to be successful. And I think we have a perception of the past that probably, doesn't align with the realities. We didn't put a man on the moon overnight, and yet we look back, our memories are short, and we seem to have this attitude or belief that we can do things overnight, we can do things quickly. And I guess in the grand scheme of things, the grand scheme of history, the United States has accomplished a lot in a very short period of time, but this doesn't mean that experience applies everywhere. And Afghanistan, is a perfect example. 20 years in Afghanistan, $1 trillion of investment, billions in foreign assistance, and at the end of the day, what do we have? It is as if 20 years never existed. I refer to it as the American interlude. The Taliban won the civil war in Afghanistan in the 90s. We came in, for 20 years they sat back, and after 20 years they returned again. America in Afghanistan was well-intentioned. We had allies on the ground. Afghans wanted us to succeed. But at the end of the day, Afghans started sitting on the fence as they saw our own sort of patience starting to ebb, our own commitment to the country started to ebb, and at the end of the day, things collapsed there quickly because Afghans recognized that we weren't committed to the long haul. We weren't going to solve the problems in the country in 5 years, and 10 years, and 20 years. No, we were tackling a country that had just come out of almost 50 years of civil conflict and hundreds of years of lack of development. So we need, I think, to inject at times within our foreign assistance and diplomatic approaches a bit of humility, and that would, I think, gain us quite a lot. We don't have all the answers, and probably one of the lessons that I took away from Afghanistan was Afghans knew their problems better than us. They lived through their problems. They dealt with them every day. We should have put Afghans more and more in the lead, but the amount of resources and the amount of troops and civilian experts we put in the field resulted in our taking the lead, our driving things, and leaving, I think, Afghans, fortunately, in the shadows. So.
As we begin to see a shift into a multipolar world, how do you expect great power conflict between the US, China, and Russia to impact the Middle Eastern corridor? Will players like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE begin to see an increase in eminence in the shifting geopolitical landscape?
We're seeing things play out already. China is looking at the Middle East as not only a marketplace for its goods, but it's also looking at the Middle East as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, linking ports and transportation networks across the world. China has serious interest in the Suez Canal and having access to the Suez Canal. It's looking clearly at markets across the Middle East. China is heavily invested already in Egypt. Russia has a base in Syria, had a base in Syria under the Assad regime, and is now negotiating with the successor government about maintaining the base. Russia is also present in eastern Libya, which is giving them access to oil, to other natural resources, and giving them both a base and a transportation network into sub-Saharan Africa, where they are heavily involved through their Wagner forces, also known as Africa Corps, sowing instability and in return receiving access to minerals and other natural resources. So, the region's already at play, or in play. Qatar, Turkey on one side have some mutual interests. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have their own interests, often aligned with Egypt. So the region is very fluid these days. The old US managed or US led sort of regional framework of security and cooperation no longer exists. And the US is, given the absence of the US or the breakdown of that, previous security arrangements, it's sort of every man, every country for themselves, and oftentimes in conflict. We look at the region sometimes as homogenous, particularly when we look at the Gulf and the oil-producing states, but all of them have their own agendas, and those agendas have played out at the expense of Syrians, of Libyans, as the various countries have pursued their own ambitions and their own goals in those countries. Yemen's another place, of course, one of the probably, if not the greatest humanitarian disaster, crisis of the 21st century, maybe the second now after Sudan and the mass displacement that's occurred there over the last couple of years. But all of these places, Syria, Sudan, Libya, Yemen, what's happening in these countries are proxy wars over regional influence and resources. And I believe this is a direct consequence of the U.S., for good or bad, retreating from the region.
A quicker and a more personal note, what is your fondest memory during your time overseas, and what advice to other individuals would you give for them to seek out similar opportunities?
Question, or second part of the question first. You have to take risks. You have to be willing to take risks. When I first went to the Middle East, I had finished my undergrad degree, and I decided I had an interest in the Middle East from areas of study, and so I went. I rolled the dice. I went to Jordan, studied some Arabic, and then I took on some volunteering opportunities, and it sort of went from there. I spent 4 or 5 years in the Middle East. I lived in Syria, I lived in Kuwait, I lived in Saudi Arabia, each for about a year at a time. And eventually, when I absorbed as much and got as far as I thought I could without further expertise and further education, then I returned and got a master's. But so I think, you have to be willing perhaps to make decisions and take some risks outside of your comfort zone to distinguish yourself from others perhaps who are out there trying to pursue similar career goals. And you can find some of those opportunities here in the United States as well. You don't have to necessarily go overseas, but I think it's important to get some real world experience that you can then translate in the workplace. Just a degree alone is probably not sufficient because there's a lot of competition. So you have to have something that is going to set you apart and distinguish you. And I think the fact that I had the opportunity to live in the Middle East for a little while helped me out. In terms of fondest memories, too many. I still have friends in the Middle East. I mean, I have colleagues in the Middle East, and I call them friends. I mean, I met them perhaps, through work, but I know them. If I go to the Middle East, I will often stay with them rather than at hotels. I know their children. I now know their grandchildren. I know their children when they were infants or very young, and now they're adults with their own kids. I could travel to a number of countries tomorrow and feel like I was, maybe going home again. So it's the friendships that came from, what initially perhaps were working relationships. So it's hard to say what's my fondest memory because I have too many good friends and too many, interesting and exciting experiences I've had with them. And not all of them were work related. Some were just, experiences we had sort of socially or off hours. But to have this I think is a lesson for foreign assistance providers and implementers. If you're working in a foreign country and everything is work and everything is all relationships and all endeavors are just through the prism or of the lens of work, you're not going to be that successful. Good partnerships are based on, I think, shared ideals and goals, and at some point, friendship. My career, I've been able to weather the second Intifada in 2000 at a time when I had a large Palestinian portfolio under my management, whether the implications and the impacts of the invasion of Iraq and all that manifested itself after that, even more recently after October 7th, in which we saw a great deal of polarization both here in the United States and overseas. I mean, the fact that my relationships in the region, my partnerships were grounded in shared ideals and partnerships and friendships helped me, definitely, and helped the work I was doing weather all the ups and downs of, regional situation and environment.
Even speaking to you and previous guests, one thing I really come to recognize is that it is about those relationships that you make. It's not necessarily always like the political game, if that makes sense. It's like you mentioned, having that connection and that like friendship with somebody it comes from a good place, and I feel like it helps us achieve things to a much more successful degree, even if that wasn't our intention in the first place. It was just kind of connecting with people. But we just wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you coming out, and we're super grateful for your dedication and for your service over the past however many years you're here.
Thank you.
No, it's a great pleasure to be here.
We appreciate your time with us here today. This has been Noah Mohammedelamien and Farah Shah from UCF's Global Perspectives and International Initiatives. Make sure to keep up to date with our future events and initiatives by visiting our website at ucfglobalperspectives.org. That's all for this episode, and see you next time.